Hi everyone, welcome to the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center on this absolutely beautiful Thursday afternoon. Hopefully you can get down to the beach and enjoy it while it lasts. Today we have two very important guests. First we have Professor Nikolai Petro. He's a professor at the University of Rhode Island and expert on U.S.-Russia relations and Russian politics. He is currently joining us from Ukraine and we're very excited to have him. So welcome, Professor. Thank you so much for being with us.
Hi there.
So just to get started, it's been a couple days since the Trump-Putin meeting. There's been a lot of buzz from both sides of the aisle. And where do things stand where you are?
There's not that much obsession with the nature of American, the American debate. It's mainly here in Ukraine about, well, what did they say about Ukraine, which was very little apparently. So the current political leadership in Ukraine is rather disappointed about that, but they are in their own, getting ready for their own presidential campaign. They're going to have presidential elections next March, and people are already starting to attack each other on all sorts of issues, including foreign policy issues. So my main takeaway is that most of what is discussed in the United States, people around the world just really don't care.
That seems to be a common theme lately.
Well, I mean, there's so much inside baseball, essentially, if you will, which is another game that people don't play around the world. So, it's amusing, but after a while, there's not that much that you can take from that.
Absolutely. And what were your thoughts? You have a kind of different perspective than most Americans. You weren't raised in the United States, and you've lived in both, so you have a very unique perspective, especially when it comes to U.S.-Russia relations. What were your initial thoughts after the summit?
Like most analysts of Russia, I was struck by how different Trump's tone was from many of his predecessors. It was interesting and I think encouraging that he began by noting how much Russian-American relations had deteriorated and that he was going to try to change things. Well, obviously, if you're going to try to improve relations, you want to say good things about your partner so that they want to say good things about you.
Definitely.
And basically begin a dialogue, begin a relationship. It's just the beginning. And it's not even going to go anywhere if you start just yelling at each other. And I think it was President Putin who was in the subsequent interview to Fox News. He said, "Why would anybody travel all this distance just to yell at us, at each other?" So obviously that was not the thing to start doing. Besides, there's plenty of people in Washington to yell for about all sorts of reasons. So I think it was very good, in fact, that they sat down, they talked to each other, they had private meetings, they had public meetings, and that's all for the best. Dialogue, I think, is good. And the key thing to remember about dialogue is the Greek origins of the word, dialogos, two voices. And in order to have a dialogue, two voices need to be heard.
Definitely. So where do you think we are now? What do you think's next? There's been a lot of, President Trump's been taking a lot of flack because, he's walking back on what he said. He's kind of going back and forth of, well, I do support Putin, I don't support Putin. Where do you think will the next step be? Just this morning, as I'm sure you know, he announced he wants to have another meeting at some point with President Putin. So where do you think things stand?
We're at the beginning of a process. We don't know how serious it can be and how much relations can improve. If relations are going to improve, they're not going to improve through the meeting of two people. What those two people do is they give marching orders to thousands of people under them. And those thousands of people in the bureaucracy, in the military, in the State Department, in the Treasury Department, all over over the government have to take those orders and begin to improve relations and begin to do things that have so far they have been forbidden to do, which is to talk to their counterparts. So literally, relations will improve when the thousands of people on each side in government are allowed to talk to each other. And since the relationship has always been, the sanctions have prevented the American government from talking to the Russians, whereas the Russians have always said, let's talk. Well, clearly it has to begin, the sanctions have to be lifted from the American government on itself to allow Americans to have broader and more intense relationship with their Russian counterparts at every level. But until, and that's a long process, that the message has to get through, there has to be a new agenda. It's helpful that on both sides, it's anticipated that there will be commissions set up, which will look at how to do that sort of thing for economics, for the military, for foreign relations. So it's a long process, and we're hardly at the beginning of anything.
Do you think that that process is even possible, though? I mean, there's always been the deep animosity between Russia and the United States. There were, of course, following the Cold War, there's still lingering feelings of, oh, we can never be aligned, we're too different. Do you see a world where Russia and the United States can become on friendly terms and even become allies?
Historically, before 1917, Russia and America were among the closest partners internationally. As a matter of fact, there are historians who argue that Tsar Alexander II's support of the North in the Civil War, including the basing of the Russian fleet in New York, was crucial to the success of the war effort by preventing a successful British and French blockade of the North that would have supported the South, because they supported the Southern cause, the Confederacy. So that was something that was acknowledged with great sympathy and thanks by American presidents at the end of the 19th and early 20th century. The rivalry and enmity began with the communist takeover in Russia, which is why many people expected that with the end of communism in Russia in 1991 and its overthrow by the Russian people, that a new leaf could be turned. But we run into psychological problems. People who have lived their whole life thinking of Russia as the Soviet Union don't have a way out.
It's hard to change your worldview that drastically. They don't have any
framework. Right. They don't have any framework for thinking of Russia as what it now is trying to become, a different country from the Soviet Union. Young people, like you and I,
of course,
have an opportunity that that you're not as essentially as burdened by that. You can base things on what you see. And I think the example shown by what is the media portrayal, for example, of Russia, as contrasted to the real Russia that 2.5, 3 million people saw by visiting Russia, foreigners, by visiting Russia during the World Cup, was just so stark, such a vast contrast, that it really gave a lot of people pause, saying, well, why are we being told, really, to think about Russia as an enemy when there's so many great friendly people and it seems like a very open, tolerant society? Why can't we be friendlier? So I think the more we have those kind of real-life personal exchanges, the more people will come to realize that very often news reports and governments have their own agenda, which may be rooted in politics of a different generation from what we're living in today.
So as the next generation and the generation past that, as we move past the Cold War era, the Cold War mindset, you think we will
inevitably
rebuild that relationship?
Right. I mean, it struck me. I did a little study once about it's been more than a quarter century since the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Communist Party is not a power at all and hasn't been for nearly as long as that. I did a study and it showed that all presidential candidates in the United States, it's a long campaign, and over this entire period, including the most recent one, every single one of them has made a slip of the tongue and referred to Russia as the Soviet Union, even though the country itself has not even existed for 25 years. That just shows you how deeply ingrained the mindset of Russia as a communist country is, when it has absolutely no basis in reality.
That's true. I think a lot of people find the words interchangeable, even though it's not technically the name anymore, but a lot of people will think, oh, the Soviet Union, it's the same
and
as
it hasn't been for a generation. Yeah.
And so you're currently in Ukraine. Just a few years ago, there was a whole lot of news surrounding Ukraine when Russia annexed part of it, the Crimea. Where does Ukraine stand now?
Well, it's undergoing a difficult reform effort. The nature of that reform, the reforms that are being attempted by the government, are very controversial, because after the Maidan revolution in 2014, the agenda of the government became breaking off all ties with Russia. And that's very difficult for Ukraine, not just for the obvious cultural, religious, linguistic reasons, but because Russia has always been, and until the government attempted it, it was Russia's largest trading partner. It was Russia's largest outlet. And the orientation of the current government has been to end that and to replace those ties with Europe. But the problem is that Europe is not willing to invest as much money in Ukraine as Russia has invested. Now, however, the situation is that Ukraine doesn't have the Western money and doesn't have the Western ties and connections that it was hoping to get in the last 4 or more years, and it has lost those to Russia. And one of the truisms that I constantly remind people of here is that there has to be a rethinking of this policy, because there is no example of a country in history that has been prosperous by making a larger, more powerful, and richer neighbor its enemy.
That's definitely the truth, and we've seen the precedent now of annexation. And do you think it's a possibility that Russia would try to take over more of the country?
I don't see that as very plausible. But if there would have been an attempt, the logical time to do it was when the armed forces were reeling, the Ukrainian armed forces were reeling, right at the beginning of 2014. Instead, Russia stepped back, as it did in Georgia, and said, our interests are in Crimea, which is a vital strategic asset for the Russian fleet, and we wish to support the Russian-speaking population in eastern Ukraine, because they are rebelling against the changes that they've seen take place in Kiev, and they want to arrange some sort of autonomy in Ukraine. But the rhetoric has now has since then, has basically remained the same, but remained in a frozen position, with Russia asking asking Ukraine, the government in Kiev, to negotiate with its own citizens in eastern Ukraine, whereas the government in Kiev says uh, they're puppets of Russia, so we're not going to negotiate with them. At first, right off the bat, they called them terrorists. That's 6 million people, terrorists. And then after that, they simply said, well, last year, as a matter of fact, they decided that this was not going to, there was no longer a terrorist operation at the end of last year, but that this would now be called a war of defense, a defensive war against Russia. But Russia really has done nothing new in the last 4 or 5 years on that front, and I don't see what could possibly lead to them expanding or doing anything different from the policy they have. Because essentially the ball, they've negotiated, they've helped to bring the negotiation of the so-called Minsk agreements. Now the problem is that Ukraine is not implementing those agreements because they would in fact allow for autonomy in eastern Ukraine. And they don't want that anymore. So it's very much a domestic internal matter for Ukraine.
Well, it'll be very interesting to see how that turns out, as well as the later ramifications of
It'll be
meeting.
It's a long historical process.
Everything, all big changes generally are.
Yeah.
Nothing happens overnight. Well, thank you so much for joining us and lending us your expert opinion on the matter and a very interesting perspective we don't always get in the United States. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us from halfway across the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel.
So much, Professor Nikolai Petro. And if you stay with us, we'll be right back with our next guest here on GoLocal Live. Hi everybody, welcome back to GoLocal Live here in the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. With me now is Linda McDonald. She's a registered nurse and the president of UNAP, here to tell us about the upcoming possible strike of nurses at Rhode Island Hospital. So first off, thank you so much for joining me today, Linda.
You're welcome. Nice to meet you.
You as well. So can you just start by giving us a little bit of overview of the situation?
The overview of today's situation is that the 2,400 members of the Rhode Island Hospital Local are voting today on whether to accept or reject the offer that is on the table from the Lifespan Corporation.
And when will that vote take place?
That vote is taking place all day today. We've had meetings. We have 6 scheduled meetings, as well as members come and vote on their way to work.
So we'll know by the end of the day if a strike is coming.
You will know by the end of the day. The last meeting is 8:15. I would think we'd be counting the votes by around 10 o'clock.
And if it is if the measure is voted down, then the strike would commence on Monday.
If it is a reject, then the strike would commence Monday at 3 p.m. and it's a 3-day strike with a 1-day lockout, so we would return to work Friday at 3 p.m.
And so tell us a little bit of background. What led up to this? I'm sure this is months in the making. You don't just go on strike for all the time. What's led to the situation where we're at now?
The situation, we've been negotiating for several months. I am not at the negotiating table, so I can't give you specifics of that. But the members of this local do not take this action lightly. That's why we have what some people call an extra vote today. And the retaliatory nature of working for Lifespan and the removal of millions and millions of dollars, over probably $12 million from the negotiating table yesterday, has enraged the members that once again, not only do they spend multi-millions of dollars on hiring consultants to tell them what their staff, if they really ask, could tell them, but now they have taken $12 million off the table, and we see this as a provocative and punitive measure for workers that are the backbone of taking care of patients every day. This is undisputed. These are skilled nurses, technologists, and therapists. And they really see Lifespan move to remove that money as a provocative move and has derailed these negotiations.
And so are all nurses at Rhode Island Hospital part of the union?
Yes, all registered nurses at Rhode Island Hospital, bedside caregivers, as well as respiratory therapists, diagnostic imaging, which is mammography, CT, ultrasound, surgical techs, are all part of the UNAP.
And so the concern that's come up a little bit is, Rhode Island Hospital is a massive hospital. Do you think they'll be able to keep up the demand for nurses and provide quality care to people who are there?
You know, Rich, that's a very good question, and I can only give you an example. On any given day, anybody who comes to the Rhode Island Hospital emergency room can see some chaos of taking care of patients. They're very sick when they come in, they're critically ill in some cases. Trauma rooms can be doubled and tripled, but there's an expertise of these emergency room nurses that they know where the equipment is, they know where the supplies are, they know how to talk to the EMTs, they know their docs. Whereas if you bring in replacement workers, as the hospital said they will, be staffing, that seems impossible. And I would say for patients next week to think twice about coming to the emergency room at Rhode Island Hospital.
So you believe that the care will be effective?
I think when you understand the level of care that these nurses and other health professionals give every day, that it would be impossible to bring in half the amount of workforce, not used to our charting, not used to any part of what we do. I think it's impossible, absolutely impossible to think that they can give the quality of care that our nurses and health professionals give every day.
These are very, very strong words. And so when was has there been a strike before?
No, there has never been a strike at Rhode Island Hospital, and I think that bodes for how carefully and how deeply we consider our actions and what we are doing today.
Absolutely, and it seems like this seems to be a growing issue. I believe it was last year, there was the big nurses strike at Tufts. There have been teachers striking all over the country, so this isn't just a local issue.
I think it's probably not just a local issue. What is very clear to me is that some of the problems with a corporate healthcare model, which Rhode Island Hospital, Lifespan, which all the hospitals seem to be forced into, pulls away proper staffing. You've got to tighten your belt, but you can't tighten your belt by not giving adequate staffing, by supplies not being available. by having ancillary staff at bare minimum, and expect there not to be expectations of unionized nurses, at least, that when it comes time to negotiate a contract, and by the way, by Lifespan's own admission, they have put out in a statement last week that they have known that the Rhode Island Hospital UNAP members are under market valued, so to speak, and they have done nothing to correct that in all these years.
So even Lifespan admits that they haven't given enough, but they're still not willing to give more.
We cannot continue to be a training ground, bring in a nurse, train them, and due to the stress or the lack of competitive salaries, have them then leave and go to other states surrounding us. And this process has to stop. And we are looking for a fair and equitable conversation. We feel Lifespan has, is a punitive corporate employer in what they do, and they have not looked at what these negotiations. There was a survey of the employees done last February, and in that statement, the UNAP members and others, they admitted that they know that they are lacking in some of the issues that are being denied, actually, in the press.
So in a way, this strike isn't just for nurses, it's for patients as well, to improve patient care and make sure they can get the best care available.
As I said, to ask 2,400 nurses and health professionals to leave their patients is not taken lightly, and if we can improve the conditions at Rhode Island Hospital with a competitive wage and keep and train nurses, that will only help patient care.
Definitely. And is there anything else you'd want to share with the public about it? What would you say to someone who said, I don't really know, like, why should I support you? I don't really know what's happening.
Again, I hate to keep mentioning the amount of members that we represent, but they all have, most of them have families and friends and other relatives who understand, who see how hard they work, and I believe that they will support this action next week. And also, I do believe that we're hoping that the patients and their families that we take care of, that have relied on us and do rely on us every day, will support us in this effort and help us to get back to doing what we do best, which is to take care of patients. And again, this is the backbone of patient care at Lifespan or any hospital. And their actions this week once again show their punitive action of how they treat their employees.
And if the strike does go through next week, do you think that will be enough to convince Lifespan to come to the table and come to an agreement?
I think it will take some time. We hope to get back to the table. We hope to reach an agreement, and down the road we will have to decide what further actions we take if the attitude remains the same.
Great. Well, I know it's a very busy day for you,
it is
so
a busy day.
we'll let you get going. But thank you so much for joining us, Linda McDonald, registered nurse and president of UNAP. We should know by the end of the day whether or not there will be an upcoming strike at Rhode Island Hospital. So I know we're all keeping an eye out to see what happens. But thank you so much for joining us. And that does it for us today. We'll be back tomorrow for our noon show, kick off the weekend a little early. And so here in the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center, I'm your GoLocal Live host, Rachel Nunes. Have a great day.